Hi guys, this is Dave Barrett, and this is app number 3 of JavaScript 30, which is a challenge to build 30 apps using vanilla JavaScript. Now, what you can see here, this had to do a lot with CSS Variables, which is newer to CSS, I guess in the past few years. Sass does have their own version of variables. The difference between CSS Variables and Sass Variables is that Sass variables, those are processed at compile time. So once you compile your website, those variables are inserted into the page, and you can't really change or modify those variables live. And so CSS variables allow you to be able to modify the values of those variables in real time. And so this is kind of cool. So what you can see here, I have first an image, right? Someone hiking a mountain. And then there's actually a div around this called with a class of controls, right? But there's 4 inputs. So one that controls the spacing. These are range inputs. One that controls the blur effect, right? So that's kind of cool. This one is a color picker or a color input. Allows you to kind of change. Let's see here, if I pick blue, boom, you see the border color of the image changes to blue, and also coincidentally, the JS part of the title changes to blue. And then border radius is one that I added that wasn't part of the challenge, but I just wanted to kind of get some extra practice with it. So, and that changes the corner border radius up to about like 50 pixels or whatever I set it to. So let's take a deeper look into this and how we ended up doing this. So as I kind of mentioned, you have the controls are wrapped in a div just to keep them contained. Then we have a label. So the label would be spacing, blur, base color, the actual word, and then an input right next to it. Now there's several inputs that are of type range, and what range is you can specify the value range. So in a range, you want to specify the minimum value that range will start at and the maximum value that it can end at. And then you'll have a value attribute on that HTML element as well that contains the current value. So like for now, when I start the page, it's gonna start at value 10 for spacing, which coincidentally has a minimum value of 10 as well. So just to kind of walk through those attributes again, we have the ID for each of these, type, range, obviously, name. Now this is going to be used to store the name of our CSS variable so that we can reference it later in JavaScript a lot more easily. Sorry. And then also, in addition to max, min, and value, we have data dash sizing. Now these are data attributes. These are completely custom. You can put anything you want in there. You just put data dash, whatever you want. You can store any information in there. In this case, data dash sizing contains pixels. So that's something that I'll get to later. So now we go down. That's the HTML side of this. If we go down into the CSS, what I did was I experimented using these CSS variables. So at the root, this is typically where you're going to want to store global CSS variables, is at this root element or root, space. So we have the base, spacing, blur, and these are just names I made up for the variables. And then I store the values. And this is very useful because when I do this, all I have to do is write it once here, and then throughout my code, wherever I want these values to be plugged in, I could just say, padding, var, parentheses, spacing, and just call in that variable's value, whatever that variable's at. And that's going to plug in 10 pixels. So I can just say spacing. I don't have to remember the exact value as I'm coding this out. So that can be useful to just be able to reuse values like that. Now, let's scroll down into the JavaScript side of this. So what I did first was I stored each of the inputs, each of these inputs, into a variable called inputs. Okay, so using a query selector, pulled those in, and then I created a function called handle update. And what this does is it will change the style, the CSS style of any attribute that's being used from any of these inputs. So to do this, right, I had to use for each loops. So inputs, taking all of these inputs, I loop through each of them, and I'm adding an event listener. So on change, on this change event, trigger the handle update function. Also, doing the same thing on mouse move, handle the update function. And I'll show you why I did this. So if I was to just use, when I was just using on change, let's actually save this and reload here real quick. Here, let's do this here so that it's easier to see. I am on this input and I don't see any value changing live, right? I'm just seeing the slider slide, but the image isn't changing. It's not until I let go of the mouse that I see the image change, and that's fine, right? But I think to give the users a better experience, adding this on mouse over, or on mouse move, sorry. Save that, refresh. Now you can see the blur change, so you can adjust it to what you like. So that's why I have both of these event listeners on there. So what I did here with the handle update, what it's doing is it's storing this data set.sizing into a suffix. So if we remember what that data set.sizing is referring to, it's actually referring to this pixel thing, and that's necessary because it's needed to specify on some of these CSS attributes what it is. If it's just 10, it's not going to update, it's not going to change. It needs a unit value. So adding that pixel helps me to do that, or adding that data set.sizing adds those pixels onto the end. So document.documentElement.style, set property. So this is changing the CSS property of this. It's a dynamic value using template strings. This represents, this section represents the name attribute of each of these. So, and I've made sure that the name attribute is the exact same as the variable that I use to plug in for those CSS attributes. And then this part plugs in the value. So the value attribute, what it's currently at, plus suffix, which would be pixels. And so that's what does it. As you can see, it works pretty well. I'm sure there's other fun things I could add. I'm interested to see if I could ever, like make a full-on photo editing app. That would be kind of interesting. But this was really fun to build. I'm excited to show you my next app. And thanks for watching. I appreciate and look forward to your feedback. Thank you.